Welcome everyone to our segment 1 classes. This is our class for September 2018, and we're going to start 4 months in which we do a series on chart interpretation, and we'll work with a different volunteer each month. And so new students or associates that are just coming along this fall, I've invited you to respond to me via email and let me know if you want to be a volunteer. You have to be able to attend this class live so we can interact with each other, and then I'm just drawing names out of a hat. And so before, get myself going. Before we get started though, in case some of you don't know, we do offer a free weekly audio podcast that's on our website. We also have our Astro Library. That's where we just put all the public webinars, conferences, workshops, all the materials that we have done over the last 15 years out there end up in the Astro Library, as you can see on your screen. And then of course the EA course, we have 3 different segments to that if you want to have materials for both segment 1 or segment 3 as well. So let's just jump right into our material today on the planetary method of chart interpretation. Probably all know that this is the Jeffrey Wolf Green method of evolutionary astrology, and he received this methodology in dreams, and then he did observation correlation with charts, thousands of charts, just really fine-tuning this method with Pluto and the nodes, which we'll go into. First of all, though, I want to say in regards to the natal birth or radix chart that they will sometimes call it, this chart will not show you the gender of the soul, nor will it show you their evolutionary state of consciousness, that consensus individuated, spirituated that we talk about in EA. You actually have to have an observation correlation with the person whose chart you're looking at in order to discern where you feel their evolutionary state of consciousness is at. And I worry less about knowing that right off the beginning of any consultation with a client. It's something that you can just allow to unfold throughout the session if you want. We do ask it in our environmental conditioning questions, but it's not always necessary for the person to know it. Again, it's something that can unfold over time. And as you start to study evolutionary astrology, it's something that you will get more proficient at over time as well, because, you know, astrology in general is like learning a new language. You know, you don't get one tennis lesson and play perfect tennis, or one bike lesson and ride your 2-wheeled bicycle. It's the same with anything else in life that you are working with. And then over the years, I've developed some, specifics in regards to how I look at the environmental conditionings, religious, spiritual, parental, social, economic, and this allows you to get an orientation towards the chart in question. We'll see this as we're working with our volunteer chart today. Now, I want to say something about these classes. I'll just put these are actually the questions that I send out anytime someone's a volunteer. And it's also what I use anytime I do a session with a client. But what I want to say about this class and the next 3 classes on chart interpretation, we're going to do the same thing 4 times. This is not really a beginner's class today. As Leroy had said before the recording of the call, you want to go back to 001, 2, 3, 4, those classes, and that's where we really go back to the philosophy of EA, understanding those different evolutionary states of consciousness and their substates. And then we go through this planetary method in general. So I refer you back to those archived webinars that you can go through to kind of get that background if you feel like you're a beginner and you think maybe some of the material today is going too fast. Go back to those archived webinars, especially over the next month in between now and October's class. And so here's the different environmental conditioning questions that I always ask someone to respond to when I'm looking at a chart. And I wanted to just start off and say a couple of words in regards to Mars and Pluto as a planetary pair. This is something that EA utilizes to determine how many lifetimes the soul has been working upon a specific Pluto house, say natal Pluto in the 2nd house or natal Pluto in the 6th house. There's no finite number of how many lifetimes the soul will choose one particular Pluto house. And yes, they will work their way around all 12 houses, and you can do it more than once. But when you're looking at a specific chart, you can look at the phasal and aspect relationship between Pluto and Mars and tell whether or not it is a primary lifetime or a secondary lifetime. And how we look at the primary lifetimes, that is when Mars and Pluto are in one of the specific 45-degree aspects. I'll show you a visual on the next screen. And I have come to, it's got to be an applying or separating aspect with a little tighter orb. Evolutionary astrology uses wider orbs than general astrology. And that's because we look at the aspects as always in a process, you know, birth, growth, bloom, decay, death to rebirth in 0 to 360. And so we kind of tighten those orbs up though when it comes to those 45-degree aspects that we call the primary lifetimes with Mars, Pluto. Secondary lifetimes are when Mars and Pluto are in a phasal relationship to each other, but they don't have a specific aspect. Or Mars and Pluto can be in one of the many other aspects they can have, but it's not one of the 45-degree aspects. Now let me just show you a generic visual for this. We always compare faster moving planet to slower moving planet in general. So it's as if Pluto would be right here at 0 degrees. And if Mars was balsamic within 355, 350, or yeah, 355, 356 degrees to 360, or Mars is 1 degree, 2 degrees away from Pluto, this would be a primary lifetime, and this would either be balsamic conjunction, finishing up 8 previous primary lifetimes, or if Mars is new phase Pluto, just getting ready to initiate new soul lessons specific to whatever house Pluto is in, with Mars being that new conjunction. If you find Mars within a few degrees of 45 degrees away from Pluto, this is a primary lifetime. A Mars-Pluto square primary. So here are these 8 45-degree marks that if Mars is in relationship to Pluto within 5 degrees on either side of these, that again, it's a primary lifetime. And by primary lifetime, it means that there is a real urgency within the soul to learn those desires and its lessons, again, relative to the 8 phases and relative to the specific signs and houses. Now, I'll repeat this over the next 3 classes, and we'll look specifically with each chart. So you're going to get some example to see how this really works. if, for instance, we had Mars 60 degrees away from Pluto, wherever it's at as you go around the circle, that would be a secondary lifetime. If Mars was in a trine, or if Mars was in a quincunx or inconjunct compared to Pluto, that would be a secondary lifetime. Now, anytime you have questions, that Q&A panel that you see your orange arrow on your screen, you can click on that orange arrow to detract your panel of everything that goes on. You can click on that orange arrow to expand it, and there is a Q&A there. And anytime you have questions, by all means, type your question in. Leroy, bless his soul, answers questions as best as he can. If you are on a headset of any kind and you want to interact live, you are more than welcome to raise your hand. And that's that little, there's a little symbol for the hand there. And if you click on that, that tells us you want us to unmute you and you want to ask a question. So if anything's coming up that you don't understand, that you have questions with, by all means, raise your hand or type it into that Q&A panel, and we'll do our best to answer all the questions between us. Now, here's our chart for today. We have a male volunteer. The data is February 9th, 1948, 6:35 p.m., Galveston, Texas. Volunteer, I had all my PowerPoint slides done before I knew which house system you used. The nice thing between Potpourri and your preference of Placidus houses, nothing changed houses. All the planets are in the same houses. So I just left this example today with Potpourri houses. But before we even get into this chart, I just want to show you. Here's Pluto. 13.5 Leo retrograde in the 12th house. If we start with Pluto at 0 degrees, you can see we go about 27 degrees before we get to Mars. So Mars Pluto is new phase. However, if Mars was, say, hanging out here at 16 degrees Leo, that'd be the conjunction. That'd be one of those primary lifetimes. The fact that Mars is new phase, but not a specific aspect, so to speak, or it's not 27 degrees, 17 degrees, excuse me. This would be considered more of a secondary lifetime. Mars Pluto is new phase, so that tells us there's been one primary lifetime with Pluto in the 12th house. There may have been 1, 2, 5, 10 secondary lifetimes as Mars is moving beyond Pluto. There's no set numbers, okay? It's more specific to the 845-degree aspects primary lifetimes. Soul chooses how many secondary lifetimes to really get that Mars-Pluto phasal relationship before it'll then move into the next phase. Now, another question that can come up is if this soul in today's example has a 12th house Pluto, were they a 12th house Pluto in their last life? Will they be a 12th house Pluto in their next life? I don't know. My practicality tells me that it might be possible that we could go back and forth between the houses. I really don't know the specific answer to that question. And unless we can, have the past life recall and go back and get a birth certificate from a past life, there really isn't any specific way to verify it. I worry less about that and more about just what is that phasal relationship of Mars to Pluto to give me an idea how long the soul's been working with that specific Pluto house. Now, this volunteer, this environmental conditioning is going to show up whenever we have the chart, and I put the whole chart up for right now. No asteroids, but I did include Chiron, the Centaur. This person was raised in the Southeast until they were in their early 30s. He has two sisters, half brother, very distant relationship with alcoholic parents. They divorced once the kids reached adulthood. Dad was an angry person. He quieted down as time went by. He wasn't necessarily violent. Mom was very quiet. Lower middle class. The parents went through 2 bankruptcies, so there was always the issue of having enough resources, which was some of the conditioning for this soul. There wasn't much religious conditioning, even though he was raised in the Bible Belt. However, he was always interested in spirituality from a very early age, looked into Edgar Cayce, involved in the New Age movement, found transcendental meditation when he came back from the Vietnam War. He lived in a meditation community in Iowa for 7 years. He has a master's in transpersonal counseling psychology, which was his occupation. He currently works part-time in a Waldorf school in that guidance and counseling arena. 2 children from his first marriage, had a very brief second marriage for a few months. It was annulled, and he's been married for the last decade. He said there was some sexual abuse when he was young, but in all of his studies and therapeutic work, he really didn't see where there was any lasting trauma from it. So just in looking at how he answered those environmental conditioning questions, you know, you're right off the bat going, this person is at least 3rd individuated, most likely moving into 1st stage spirituated. By, again, his own words of and Jeffrey Green used to say towards the end of his teachings that he felt you know, the New Age movement really belonged into 3rd stage individuated. And yes, it bled over into 1st stage spirituated. But it's if you just, everything you study about 3rd individuated, and again, this is not a class for that, that's where there's this exploration that goes on about all these different belief systems, you know, pro, con, weighing them back and forth. To then in 1st stage spirituated, really be able to start putting it all together. I had another thought that flashed through. I'll bring it through when it comes in again. But I will point you back to those early classes to when we went through the different evolutionary states of consciousness for more information on more detailed if you want. But here's the whole chart. Now, as I, you know, teach chart interpretation in the Jeffrey method, I like to break it down to really help people get a grasp on how we use this planetary method formula with Pluto and the nodes. And so we start off with what we call the karmic dynamic. And it also can sometimes be called the Trinity of the past, Trinity being Pluto, the South Node, and the rulers of the South Node. And so natal Pluto by house sign, rulers, aspects is going to be that karmic dynamic or area to which the soul will naturally gravitate to for unconscious emotional security reasons in this life. And this especially happens early on in life. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. Many times, souls that come through and do what I call the Reader's Digest version of those evolutionary states of consciousness. It's not a better than, less than. It's the ripple in the pond expanding. And so you can come in when and speed through some consensus stuff to get to your individuation, or speed through consensus and individualizing to get to the spirituated. And we can, and it's not a static thing. You know, sometimes we'll go back and forth a little bit. We won't skip wide areas. You won't go from 3rd consensus to 1st spirituated, but you can be 3rd consensus and 1st individuated, going back and forth. You can be 1st and 2nd individuated, going back and forth. second individuated with career, but first individuated with relationships, for example. There's a fluidity to it. It's not a black and white. Many of you probably know where Pluto is by sign is the generation you were born into. Where Pluto is by house, that's your own individual soul nature. So let's go back to this chart that we have, for example. And volunteer, I'm going to rattle off a couple of things here, and then I will ask Leroy to unmute you, and we'll get you in for some feedback with us. And so volunteer, any questions you may have or comments as I'm rattling, jot them down on a little piece of paper to help you with your memory, or yeah, to help you keep track or remember details. We have a 28-degree rising Leo here, and we have Pluto in Leo. So you're going to come across lots of material on the Pluto and Leo generation. These are the generational souls from the late 30s to the mid 50s who really feel that the universe revolves around them. The Pluto and Leo generation, Jeffrey Green would say, think of the pyramid, they are on top of the pyramid and everything revolves around them. This is a very subjective generation. And as we'll find later on when we look at the evolutionary intent through the Pluto polarity point, Aquarius, their lessons are objectivity. So we won't spend a lot of time on this. Pluto Volume 1, if you want more details in regards to that. I took and recapped Pluto through all of the 12 archetypes, and the sign in the house is an interchangeable archetype. Those are also in that 1 to 33 webinars that are just in order for you in the associates area. You can go there for more specific details. We'll bring things out with Pluto Leo generation, but you know, let's not waste our 2 hours on that one. I do want to point out though that Pluto's retrograde. And when you have Pluto retrograde, which it is 5 months out of the year, so about 43% of us are born with Pluto retrograde. This means the soul is really trying to throw off past desires. The soul is trying to throw off old conditioning patterns. If we look at Pluto in the 12th house, this is what I've come to call a Pisces soul. So we have the Pluto and Leo generation, but Pisces, 12th house, soul, Pluto. And Pisces souls, these are souls who naturally gravitate towards wanting to know source. Now, if they're consensus, they're going to be in a born-again religion, so to speak, using that term loosely. You know, they could, you know, be Jewish, they could be Islam. They're going to be in consensus religion if they're in that consensus state. Or they could fall into the distortions of that and all the hedonism that will come with the 12th house that wants nothing to do with religion. Don't fence me in with the patriarchal conditionings. As you start evolving a 12th house Pluto and individualizing, they'll be going, well, they'll be wanting to break free from religion. They could go through atheism, and then they could start exploring all over the place as they get to third individuated. If you're looking at a soul who has a spirituated state of consciousness with a 12th house Pluto, they are almost exhilarating in their ability to surrender to source as they move through their lifetime. And I think, volunteer, I think you'll be okay. Everybody knows how old you are, all right? Congratulations on beginning your 8th decade on planet Earth. But as we move a 12th house Pluto through that spirituated state, life teaches them that they're not in charge. And this might be some of the struggle back and forth if you have Pluto in Leo generation in the 12th house. The Leo, The ego's going, oh, wait a minute, I don't know, I want to be in charge. And then that 12th house goes, source goes, but you're not. And so the more expanded in consciousness the soul is, the more they're going to be going, oh, how do I align my will with divine will? How do I throw off all of the false conditionings of religions and beliefs I've had for many lifetimes, especially like, first stage spirituated? How do I throw off the conditionings from this lifetime? And so, volunteer, let me bring in the notes and then we'll open the lines up. Excuse me, rulers, sorry about that. Here's the rulers of Pluto. Ruler of Pluto by sign, Pluto Leo generation. And by the way, I consider the sun to be compared to Pluto. I've evolved that in my own studies from Jeffrey's early beginnings, okay? We live in a geocentric universe. We know the sun we wouldn't be here without the sun, but we look at everything from our Earth-centered perspective. So I've come to compare the sun to the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Chiron on out. And I use Chiron loosely as a planet as well. I compare Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars to the sun in regards to that. And if you, there's a handout in your materials determining phases and aspects in which you can look at that and get some examples of that. And I can make a note here to also put it in, I'm going to make a note here to put it in an email for you just so that you can have that. The ruler by house is Neptune. Now, this is something that you don't always pay attention to when you've got that whole chart to look at, and yet I put it out on a slide this way because I want you to recognize that the two rulers of Pluto by sign and house, they will describe a lot to you in regards to the soul. Just look at this person being an Aquarius sun or personality, and that sun being a full phase opposition to Pluto. Does that tell you this is a person who is more inclined towards that objectivity than the typical Pluto Leo generation? Yes, because he has planets over there in Aquarius. Now, he's the Neptune in Libra generation, 13 degrees. Neptune is retrograde in that second house. Anybody who's born on planet Earth right now has Neptune waxing sextile to Pluto within orb. The Neptune in Libra generation can have lifetimes of projecting onto their partners savior complexes, de facto god-goddess energy, idealizing their partner, and then experiencing the letdown when the partner is human. Neptune is retrograde. They're trying to throw off those types of conditioning factors. And I look at this Neptune in the second house as another factor in helping the soul ground themselves. So here's another mitigating factor for a 12th house Pluto. In general, 12th house Plutos go, I don't want to come to planet Earth. It's too messy down there. And yet they can't learn the lessons out in the ethers. We learn it through coming into this flesh blood experience. One of my favorite Jeffrey Green quotes is evolution takes place through the emotional body. You can have all the spiritual wisdom you want, you can have all the mental genius you want, but until you live it through the flesh and the senses, the physical and emotional bodies, it isn't integrated on a soul level. And so this Neptune in the second house is a grounding factor for this 12th house Pluto. It puts a practicality second house to their spiritual searching. So we're going to find that the soul, and we'll hear feedback from them as we go through time, you know, all that spiritual searching, but what's real, what's practical, and how do I sense it, second house, for myself as I release those projections onto the partners. Okay, let me change my mind. I forgot about these rulers, and I got to watch time because we could have a 4-hour class here. Leroy, let's just check in with our volunteer and unmute them and see if there's any feedback up to this point.
I'm unmuted, I think.
Yes,
correct?
you are. Hello, volunteer.
Hello. I've been following what you're saying, and it's the opposition between the Sun and Pluto. I relate very much to that,
Mhm.
and the Neptune coming into play. Um, that also seems to deepen it. It feels like what you're saying is very accurate, because I have always approached my life and spirituality from a more objective point of view. In other words, what's actually true has always been the question, rather than, oh, that's wonderful, I want to go with some new idea or something. So it has to be very practical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. All right. Thank you. If I ever say anything that doesn't feel accurate for you, make a little note, because, again, it's not gospel here. It's interaction. Observe, correlate, observe, correlate. Okay, I'll have Leroy mute you again. Okay, so you can
Okay.
feel a little comfortable. Just and mainly for the recording. Okay, and we'll move on, and then I'll bring you in for some little bit feedback. And as we start to get going through this this series, you'll get the flavor of it, and and then by all means, if there's something that we haven't spoken about, feel free to put it into the picture. Okay. And so we also then, as we're trying to see where the soul's coming from, where the soul has gravitated to, we'll also look at the number of aspects that the other planets will make to Pluto. This is what we call that evolutionary pace. If Pluto only makes 1 or 2 aspects to other planets, it's kind of a slower pace for a soul. They're kind of taking a little bit of a rest, so to speak. But if we have someone who has, 5, 6, 7, aspects to Pluto, then it's a fast evolutionary pace, and the soul is wanting to accelerate its growth. So I will tell you, in regards to this soul in question, this is how many planets make aspects to Pluto. I spoke to the fact that Neptune, for everybody, has a waxing sextile to Pluto. Now we'll bring in this new phase conjunction with Saturn, and Saturn's also retrograde. Jupiter is making a waxing sesquisquadrate to Pluto, 135 degrees, but it's not there. It's applying about 6 degrees from the waxing sesquisquadrate. Now, I will tell you, with semi-squares and sesquisquadrates, and again, you can look back on that cycle of phases and aspects that I showed you. I will use wide orbs for planetary aspects in general, between the 45 degrees, the 135 degrees, because you're shifting from yang to yin and yin to yang phases. And that's a real difference in energy between yang energy moving out from the center and yin energy moving in to the center. Again, you could, if you want to, print yourself out 5, 10 copies of the cycle of phases and aspects, And you literally just have that crib sheet handy for you on any of our EA classes live or any archived webinars, because then you can refer to it until you get to that point where you can rattle it off. And I'll tell you, as I'm sitting here right now at my own little desk, it has a hutch to it, and I have my own copy of the cycle of phases and aspects right there. Again, I'll get it out to everybody in an email as a PDF so you can print it out so those of you who got digital only materials, it's one of those PDFs that we'll provide to let you print it out. We also have then Venus making a waning sesquisquadrate. Start with Pluto, you go counterclockwise, and you get to the 225 degree. And Venus is just 1 degree from the sesquisquadrate. So Venus is still full phase, but it's just getting ready to go into disseminating phase in regards to Pluto. And then, of course, we have the moon balsamic sun, and both making full phase oppositions to Pluto. And so that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 planetary archetypes that make aspects to Pluto. And it is then Pluto is also square the nodes. We'll say more on Pluto being square the nodes in a little bit. I just wanted to point out these aspects. That's a lot of planetary aspects. And so again, it means that that 12th house Pluto is more accelerated in its growth. It wants to evolve. It wants to change. Now, isn't it interesting for a Pluto in Leo to have Saturn new phase Pluto by 6 degrees, both of them retrograde? Saturn new phase Pluto is a soul who's initiating a new structure of consciousness. Saturn, individuated structure of consciousness. And in Leo, who am I? Who am I? And how do I want to create and structure my world? And how do I throw off all of my old realities? This new phase can still have a lot of old realities that are just under the surface for it that will float up into consciousness. 12th house, the veil is thin for 12th house Plutos. And nope, that's not me anymore. Throw it off. And they could almost feel like they go through multiple realities with this Saturn Pluto conjunction. And then again, if you come over here and see 2 planets, and these are 2 very strong personal planets, the moon, our emotional body and ego, and the sun, personality. This brings in a lot more objectivity than normal for this generation. These planets retrograde point towards, how am I going to be in this lifetime? Who am I? This can almost be someone who, from time to time, can feel like they're out of their body, looking in. That is a 12th house Pluto. That is Aquarian energy. Aquarius is that deconditioning and liberation to individualize and be who we uniquely are. It's Uranus, Aquarius, 11th house. And to have that, balsamic new moon like that, it's kind of like I'm in my body, I'm out of my body, I'm in my body, I'm out of my body. And yet remember, we have a little bit of grounding here from Neptune having rulership of Pluto on that individual soul basis. And so it can help them not always being so distorted. I'm going to speak about the planets square the nodes when we actually get to it, okay? Whenever you have planets that are square each other, just know this in general. When you have planets that are square to each other, look across to the midpoint and see if anything's there. That right off the bat will tell you you have sesqui-squadrates, square and a halves, okay? Now, the Jupiter applying to that sesqui-squadrate to Pluto is, that's going from first quarter phase to gibbous phase, okay? So the first quarter phase makes it in the natural zodiac 0 to 360. That 135 mark is 0 Leo, or excuse me, 15 Leo, not 0, 15 Leo. The trine is 0 Leo, the 15-degree Leo in that natural zodiac. So while the soul is really expanding in its beliefs on a very conscious level and searching for truth, it is reaching a evolutionary juncture whereby it's like, oh, wait a minute, I'm not the one who gets to play God. I may not know it all. There's always another step. There's always another lesson to learn. If Jupiter was already in that gibbous phase on the other side of the sesqui-squadrate, excuse me, I'm going to have to do a cough drop and take a drink. It would be a lot more Virgonian. So for our volunteer, this may be some new material for you. And if it is, it's something that you could really ponder on. In regards to Venus, getting ready to go from full phase to disseminating phase, okay? This is an evolutionary juncture of your soul going to the next level with self-reliance. Venus, Pluto, the evolution of self-reliance within the soul. And again, Placidus and Porphyry, Venus gets into that beginning of the 8th house at about 28 degrees Pisces. It's creating a level of self-reliance within your own soul so that you move through codependent relationships and go, wait a minute. And especially as we're moving, first stage spirituated and beyond, it's like I've got to have the ultimate relationship, the relationship with Source, Venus and Pisces. And then that will be reflected in my partners versus coming off of the Pluto Libra generation and Venus Pisces 8th, projecting again that saviorism and idealisms onto the partner. Maybe there was a little bit of that in some early relationships in some way. And again, this is the evolutionary juncture that I would guess is in question for this soul. Now, I don't know if Leroy, sometimes I hear him going up and down the stairs. We work in 2 different rooms, upstairs, downstairs. Leroy, if you're back in your chair, you can unmute or volunteer. Otherwise, we'll let him do it and he comes back down. Are you there, Leroy? Hold on. Well, I'm going to keep going, volunteer. Make some notes. Oh, unmuted.
Yeah, I'm here.
I'll keep going.
Kim, I'm sorry.
Okay. Oh, that's all right, honey. That's all right. I could hear you taking a little bit of a break. Quickly, if we could hear from our volunteer.
Yeah, I started laughing as you were going through this. Sort of a core question since I was young was, who am I? And that starts off originally like any teenager, who am I? Where do I fit in the world? That type of thing. And eventually, on a spiritual level, moved into a deeper question of, who really am I? And that was very helpful. I really appreciate it. Now, I do have a question. I noticed that Uranus and Mars are not on this chart.
Okay, Mars is new phase Pluto.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's why I left it out.
Okay.
Okay.
And yeah.
And
Uranus,
you go ahead.
and Uranus is exactly opposite of Jupiter, so I thought it would be in there.
I'm only doing aspects specific to Pluto.
Oh, okay. So if Uranus is exactly opposite of Jupiter, it's not in an aspect to Pluto.
No.
Okay.
It didn't show up as, but which is a good point, because if you have two planets in opposition,
mm-hmm.
and one's a sesquisquadrate, the other one should be a it should be a semi-square. You're right. That should, my software didn't bring that up.
Mm-hmm.
You're correct. Oh, let's make it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yeah.
Seven planets in the nodes in aspect to Pluto. You're correct. What happened is my software brought up the parallels, so they're parallel. Pluto and Uranus are parallel in declination. You are so correct, everyone. Uranus should be here in this opposition to Pluto as a waning semi-square, and it would be applying. So my software is probably not using the same degree orb in the semi-square as it is in the sesquisquadrate. I got to go change that.
Mm-hmm.
Got that. But yeah, you're correct in that.
Okay. Now, otherwise, everything you've been saying fits for me. I think I will have to ponder it for a while to kind of take it a little deeper. And what you had to say with Venus felt very true for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Going through that Reader's Digest version with relationships, from projecting the ideals to really wanting that inner relationship with source on the deepest level possible, and then you minimize the projections onto the partner, and the potential is to draw in that soulmate eventually versus all the karma mates.
Yeah. One other question, since I'm new to EA, I just want to ask you this question. Does EA consider major configurations, like I would have a T-square between Venus, Jupiter, and stuff, and that's why it brings that in. Okay.
This is kind of like, and that's a good question, volunteer, because this is a breakdown, so that we can just literally break it down and see how many planets aspect Pluto. It's not looking at the entire chart.
Okay. Okay.
We'll get to that at the end. All right. Yes, when you look at a chart, we'll have a tendency, we're looking at the whole chart. But the point that I'm wanting to make for everybody is how much information you can get just with Pluto by sign house and its rulers, in this case Neptune and the Sun, and then to really have an in-depth look at the soul, looking at just the planetary aspects to Pluto. No, it's not the entire chart. You're correct in that, but I'm breaking it down to emphasize teaching points.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
You bet. You bet. And I'll let Leroy mute you again. And this is also for those of you, when you start to study a chart, you can do this the same way. You can, take out planets that don't aspect Pluto just to get an emphasis in looking at Pluto in depth. Now, moving on, again, looking at my time here and how am I doing? Oh boy. The karmic dynamic, as we said, what's also included then is natal south node, which is the ego. This is how the soul operated emotionally on an egoic basis that allowed that prior karmic dynamic or Pluto to be actualized. And so if we would now look at the chart in a different perspective, and then you would also, the third part of the Trinity And even though this is sign and house, you might say, well, that's a quad. We lump this in together. The rulers of the south node by sign and house. And that's going to give you additional details about the ego from the past. So, and that includes the aspects that are made by these rulers as well. Again, I explained this in more detail in those early webinars that I talked about. So now let's just go look at Pluto and the south node. And it just so happens that Pluto's a ruler of the south node. This soul has the south node at 18.5 degrees Scorpio in the third house. The soul was born with the nodes retrograde. They're retrograde 90% of the time. The ruler by sign, Scorpio, is Pluto, the soul itself. And the ruler by house, third house, is Mercury over there at 6 degrees Pisces in the seventh house. And so if we would want to just start to look at the ego from this perspective, and again, when you take out all the other stuff in the chart, it allows you to kind of focus in a little bit. Okay. So, south nodes in Scorpios, on emotional levels, they're psychological detectives. And you put a south node in Scorpio in the third house, and they can they can tune in fine detail on just minute things. In other words, the South Node Scorpio third, if they are of an ethical perspective, they can smell a lie 10 miles away. And as we're starting to observe with, this soul in spirituated state, this would very easily be the case. Now, it's quite possible also that this soul with a south node in Scorpio has had emotional betrayals of trust in relationship, all of that Scorpio stuff that you read about. You look at one of those rulers by house being over there in the seventh house. Did we have a soul here in which partners have lied to them or partners betrayed them? Did they do that to partners? It could work both ways. This is where you would want to have a Q&A with the person to see, was it both of them? They could be very aware on emotional levels of how their communications could affect others. They could be very aware of all those subtleties of Scorpio manipulations. And to just give you an example, if we had a lesser evolved soul here, this signature could be a signature of a lot of emotional manipulation in order to be loved. You look at the environmental conditionings to this soul and all of the spiritual work they've done, all of the psychological studies that they have done, and they could be an expert in regards to relationship counseling. Just on an emotional, egoic level, they can pick up on, issues and problems with clients or friends or relationships. And, it feeds back into this own soul and their own spiritual growth. But it also, they could develop ways in which they would be helping people psychologically and spiritually, even if it wasn't overt. They would be helping lead them on their own self-discovery path just by looking at the south node. I would have Pluto in here even if it wasn't the ruler, but just looking at where the soul is coming from by way of past lives. So this is probably not the first lifetime in which the soul has been, quote unquote, the counselor. They could go back to being shaman in some way, healer in some way. You know, some classic signatures for this if we're looking at the Pluto and the nodes and these rulers in mutable signs and houses. Okay, so when we're looking, I want to bring in those aspects, and I'm just looking at the aspects that the south node makes. You can, but many times when you bring in aspects to the south node and aspects to the planetary rulers of the south node, the whole chart shows up. So I just broke this down to aspects of the south node here. Now, obviously, you can see south node is in new phase conjunction to Chiron. Nodes move backwards. Nodes are always compared to the planetary archetype or asteroid. And as we can see here, we have squares to that south node. I deliberately left the north node out. And you can see that the south node makes a waxing trine to, I think it's a waxing trine to Venus, if I had that right. Why did I have Venus in there? Oh, nope, not a trine. It is a sesquisquadrate. The south node is applying a sesquisquadrate to Venus. And Uranus was the waning inconjunct to that, which means that Jupiter should be in here too, because it would be making a waxing semi-square. And again, my software didn't bring that in there. I'm going to have to check those orbs on that. So there should be one more planet. We're not going to be able to go into a lot of detail with interpretation. As you can see, there's a lot you can start to bring into the picture and go through with this in regards to the ego. Let's just say in you know, kind of putting it together in regards to this, it just is going to add on to the picture of this soul having an inclination egoically towards relationships. With Uranus, it's going to be bringing in learning more and more communication skills, okay? Being the authority figure, or in this case, the counselor with it. In regards to Venus, this is going to add into that picture of some of that karma that we talked about before with the projections, or perhaps some codependencies that have come about it. Again, we got a slide coming up. I'll wait for that with the planets square the nodes. Leroy, would you just unmute our volunteer, see if there's any comments he has or questions? I have to kind of watch time here, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah, a couple of things I would say. When you were talking about the South Node and Mercury in the seventh, I was thinking, as a therapist, I specialize in relationship counseling and got something of a reputation as doing that, a positive reputation. And very naturally, because I would sit with people, and in 15 minutes I knew exactly what was going on in a relationship and could be helpful. So, but that was more like a deep intuition type of piece, and that was very good. Now, you mentioned something about the South Node to Venus, but you didn't say it was a trine.
No, if you start with Venus and you reverse backwards through the zodiac, the South Node is approaching a sesquisquadrate.
Okay.
Square and a half. It's actually the south node to Venus is going from first quarter to gibbous.
Hmm.
And again, it takes a little bit to learn how to do that math backwards with the
Yeah.
nodes.
Yeah. The only reason I was asking, because Venus is in Pisces, South
Mhm,
Node's in
mhm.
Scorpio, and I thought that would
Yep.
be
Yep.
true.
Chiron to Venus is a trine,
Oh. Oh, I
but
see.
the south node, yeah, Venus is a waxing trine to Chiron.
Mhm.
Okay, waxing
Okay.
trine, first quarter trine to Chiron,
Uh-huh.
because you start
Right.
at Chiron and follow the signs and houses. And so it's
Mhm.
just 3 degrees beyond. But when you start with Venus, you're going to go past 27 to be 120. Okay,
Uh-huh.
27 Pisces going
Right.
backwards to be 120 degrees. Then you got 123 degrees. You add on another 6 degrees. You're at 129, 130,
Ah,
and
okay.
the sesquisquadrate is 135.
I see. I see. Right. Okay.
And let me, if I may point out, volunteer. If
Mm.
you're a beginner to evolutionary
Mhm.
astrology, this will go right over your head. There is a 5-part series on the cycle of phases and aspects. And the last one of that 5 parts is the math review. Go to that math review webinar and start there, and then do the 4 classes on the cycle of phases and aspects to understand what I just said.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, thank you
Yeah.
for
Thank
letting
you.
me point that out.
Shoot.
Yeah, so there's another thing. You're just going to have all kinds of new things to study with your chart, aren't you?
Yes. Yes. That's great.
So why Venus has that, wonderful, waxing trine with Chiron that just allows you to, be such a smooth, soothing, easy healer. Okay.
Mhm.
And just like you said, just picking it up intuitively. That south node is moving beyond that, and it's going, okay, wait a minute. What's the tough stuff? What's the tough stuff in looking at my own self reliance, Venus, and my own personal emotional history? And then looking at it from your career, where do I have to not be the client's buddy? And where do I have to be, direct with the client and point out the stuff they have a blind eye to that they don't want to look at?
Yes.
And I bet you've had to do that once or twice.
More than once or twice.
Okay, other comments or questions, volunteer?
No, not at this point.
Let's bring in those nodes, okay? All right, so Leroy, if you will mute. Um, and then I brought in the whole chart here, but I'm going to just skip over it because of time wise. Okay, I think you're getting the picture as how I will take, and this is Solar Fire software, which allows me to just go in and say, I want to do a chart with only these archetypes. Which, again, allows me to break this down to point it out for you. And you can do the same thing when you really want to focus on charts, or if you're focusing on the coursework with the charts that we give you for assignments. You can do the same thing if you have the Solar Fire software. But planets square the nodes. We just finished up a whole series on planets square the nodes, and from Sun, Moon, Mercury to Pluto, every planet can be square the nodes. So I refer you to that series of webinars to go review either the whole works or to review specific planets if you have planets square the nodes. But basically in EA, when a planet is halfway between each node, it means there are what we call skip steps. And it also means both the south node and the north node were active in past lives creating all this karma. And that planet square the nodes, or planets, its archetype skips back and forth between the nodes, and it's not integrating those planetary lessons. That planetary archetype is arrested. For instance, if Saturn is square the nodes, there's some type of arrest in regards to the maturation process, Saturn. If Mercury square the nodes, there's some type of arrest to the left brain communications. And so, one exception, Jeffrey felt that the sun, when the sun was square the nodes, it really wasn't skipped because the sun being the center of the universe, it's, hard, who of us doesn't have a personality with our sun, even when it's square the nodes? However, there would still be karma. More detail, go to the sun square the nodes class. You always then have to find the resolution node to figure out how to stop bouncing back and forth between the skip steps. And it's the node that last passed over the planet. And I describe it because the nodes move clockwise. You start with the planet and you go clockwise to the first node. So here, oh, one more. When the south node's a resolution node, that is the consistent application for that planet. And south node means you're going to have to go back to the past. There's egoic and emotional issues from the past that's going to have to be addressed and resolved. And that's the way that planet will evolve, get past the stuckness, and then the north node will be able to evolve as well. If the north node is a resolution node, that's the consistent application. And then the future, moving forward, moving forward, moving forward becomes the bottom line. So there is a difference between the south node and the north node being the resolution node. South node is going backwards with that planet. North node is continuing to move that planet forward. When that north node is the resolution node and that planet is consistently applied there, it will have an effect on metamorphosing the south node. Again, more details, examples. We've already done 10, 11 classes because I included Chiron with that. Here is the example that I used with this chart. This has a lot of 4 planets square the nodes and 2 different resolution nodes here. So if we're looking at Pluto, the soul itself, we start with Pluto, the nodes reverse through the signs and houses. North node is resolution node for Pluto. Pluto's 13 and a half, nodes are 18. The nodes are applying squares to Pluto, which means the soul, Pluto, applying squares can create or intensify the skip steps if it's not addressing it. When you look at applying squares and separating squares, applying squares, there's opportunity to increase the karma. Separating squares, there's opportunity to resolve the karma or skip steps. Let's look at it from Saturn. Saturn's 19 degrees. Reversing through the signs and houses, we're 1 degree past an exact square. And so that's the nodes are separating squares with Saturn. So a little easier to resolve that. Now, start with the moon. The nodes are 1 degree. South node is a resolution node. It's 1 degree past. If the south node was 19, it'd be exact. Nodes move backwards. Again, I explain all this math in the cycle of phases and aspects, and we look at it every class of planets square the nodes. Start with the sun, reverse through signs houses. The south node is 2 degrees past. The nodes are separating squares with sun and moon. So the only place we have applying squares is with Pluto. Now, when we have Pluto square the nodes, the soul itself has skipped steps, going back and forth between the 2 nodes. In this case, all right, it's quite possible that this soul has past lives in which their spiritual growth would get arrested when it ran up against something that made it feel uncomfortable. Nodes are in ninth third, okay? Right brain, left brain. That south node Scorpio is fixed water. That north node Taurus is fixed earth. You start combining that all together. And again, the soul itself would kind of slow down fixed signs whenever it ran into information or belief systems, mutable houses, that it didn't agree with. And so in this lifetime, it's quite possible that periodically this soul would have its belief system turned upside down to move past the stuck points, to move past resistance. It's made a little easier because Pluto's retrograde. It wants to throw it off. The north node is the resolution node. So it's another signature of here, this soul. What could have happened for this soul is lifetimes of, death and dying for religious reasons. And so it could, have through its history, okay, had lifetimes of turning its back on religion, have lifetimes of wanting to go off to the monastery or convent and try to just isolate itself and disappear rather than being in the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day world. Okay. And and so that resolving these skip steps in a nutshell is this soul has to consistently ground its spirituality and literally walk its talk in the world, not through isolation. And the new phase with Saturn skips steps somehow as a healer. Again, if I put all this together for you, I'm breaking it down. This is the shaman signature. This is the healer. And this is coming through lifetimes on, different cultures and different belief systems and, all the patriarchal cruelty that we do to each other. And it's created wounding within the soul that sometimes it doesn't look at it, doesn't want to look at it. And yet in this lifetime, it has to look at it. If we look at this sun moon here in Aquarius 6th house, this is the sensitivity of, vibrationally feeling it. And it will detach from it sometimes, necessarily so, sometimes detaching from it, oh, I can't look at it. And yet all of this healing energy has got to be applied towards, looking at my own egoic wounding from the past. And then that's going to help me be the healer again as best as I can in helping others go back and look at their own emotional wounding. Now, I could rattle for the next, 3 hours on this. And so apologies, I have to tidbit it to just get you an understanding of this. So starting to put all this together, this is a soul who's come through many, many, traumatic experiences here on planet Earth. So you can, see how maybe they're going, I don't know if I want to come here. And yet they've got to come here and they've got to learn how to ground themselves. And with this Mars new phase, this Pluto here, and oh, well, Mars retrograde too. okay, I really am turning over a new leaf with my desire nature, in which I want to heal me as best as I can. I want to look at all of my painful experiences from the past, and I want my soul to move forward, really walking my talk in the spiritual plane. Let's unmute our volunteer.
Okay. One thing that stood out to me that you were pointing out is all of this in the fixed signs.
Mhm.
And I was thinking the way that relates to me is that I'm slow to believe anything because I let it percolate, feel it, think it, go over time. But it's always moving forward. It's always unfolding, I guess you would say. Uh, and the I've always been curious about the nodes and in those particular houses and how that relates to the sun and moon and of course the opposition of Saturn and Pluto. Those particular houses, at least it sounds like from an EA perspective, uh, like you would think of Gemini for the third house and you would think of Sagittarius for the ninth. Um,
Mhm.
how that is just unfolding in that context. Um, Thinking of Sagittarius and spirituality in that area, and of course, the spirituality in the 12th house, and then having Neptune connected to the Pluto and Saturn. Uh, so,
You know how we talk in general about, souls will go through so many different experiences. How do you know the light unless you know the dark?
mhm,
It just, lifetimes of experiencing ABC and XYZ. Okay. As I'm listening to you, I'm going, all of a sudden I had this flash of, you know, a lifetime or two in which you were born into certain places on planet Earth where you were forced to be a soldier.
mhm. Yes, I believe
Not your
that's true.
not your true nature. And when you look at the nodes in the third, ninth, what that and this can work both directions regardless of which house is south or north node. When you look at that nodal axis in third, ninth, both directions, it's trying to get to authenticity, which means where did I get caught up in patriarchal conditionings in which I, quote unquote, lived a lie in order to survive? And that's what your nodal axis can describe. So lifetimes in which you unconsciously chose to be less than your authentic self in order to live, and lifetimes in which you came in and you were forced to be inauthentic, again forced into going to be a soldier in war when you would have rather been the farmer or the priest.
Yeah, now that makes sense to me in this way. Frequently, I'm being active and maybe doing therapy, maybe working with some children at the school, and some news piece will come on, and in my mind, there's a whole military thing that runs through my mind. It just comes from nowhere. It's not my, I consider it not to be my thoughts, but it'll get running, and then I say, wait a minute, that's I don't want to go there. So it has often felt like some past life, some latent impression in the psyche rises up because it's triggered by something in an environment. So that feels very true to me.
Yes, exactly. Yep. Yep. Hmm. Yep. And so there again, and the ultimate level, there is no victimization. It's just the soul choosing an experience in order to evolve and grow. And it's getting to the point where, as we expand in consciousness, slowing down the incarnations and more selectively choosing, oh, been there, done that, don't need to do that one, okay, integrated that one, thank you, and okay, I'm going to, be, little, I get to, the evolution of the soul is we get more choice into figuring out what we want to come through and experience. And I think that's a lot of what could be going on for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've often felt that I probably had in many lifetimes in a military setting, and many lifetimes as a monk or in some monastery or something.
And that would be the extremes of these planets square the nodes. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And so, the integration is, choosing to not go to those extremes, choosing, to be able to balance it more and more, standing in your truth and doing your monk, Jeffrey Green would always say it's the path of the householder, not the monastery or the convent. So it's the priest and the nun have to just, really work their spiritual path in day-to-day life, which is the lessons of a 12th house Pluto with a 6th house Pluto polarity point, which is where we'll go next. Okay.
Okay, good.
I'm gonna have to speed us up because I gotta get us into
Yep.
2 hours. Thank you, volunteer, and thank you everyone else who's hanging in there with us. And so now we're going to flip it. Now we're going to look at the evolutionary intent, which is sometimes called the Trinity of the future. This is where we're going to look at the polarity point of natal Pluto, which describes the soul's intent in this lifetime, how we are moving forward. Now, there's an exception to the rule when Pluto's conjunct the North Node. I refer you back to earlier classes when we talk about the planetary method, specifically planetary method variations class. That's when we'll look at that. So when we look at the Pluto polarity point by sign, that is the lessons that generation has come here to learn. When we look at the Pluto polarity point by house, that is that individual soul's lessons and evolutionary intent moving forward. In this case, if we have a 12th house Pluto in Leo, the Pluto polarity point, or the PPP as we will abbreviate it, by sign is Aquarius. And we spoke briefly about how, that the subjectivity of Leo has the objectivity lessons of Aquarius. They also have those lessons of what is my role in the play. Leo, I don't get to be the director of the play. I am a participant in the play. The big kahuna, source, God, goddess, is the director of the play, not us. And when you have a 6th house Pluto polarity point, that means all that desire to know source has got to be manifested in day-to-day life. I've got to put one foot in front of the other, 6th house Virgo. I have got to be in this body. 6th house is the earth, is the earth element. The houses have the polarities, modalities, and elements just like the signs do. And when you recognize that, it can help you with putting that interpretation together of those archetypes. And so they can't, the 12th house Pluto can't be floating off in the sky all the time. They can't be off in that monastery or the mountaintop. They have to ground themselves in day-to-day living and be in the world. And as they come to do that, It will continue to metamorphose that 12th house Pluto. It will continue to metamorphose their beliefs. In other words, it's as we said before, evolution takes place through the emotional body. You can't just go off and study the spiritual wisdom. You've got to apply it. 6th house, Pluto, polarity point. And so here are the rulers of the Pluto polarity point. The ruler by sign Aquarius is Uranus over here in Gemini, retrograde 10th house. And the ruler by house, 6th house, is Mercury over here in Pisces 7th. And so in EA, Mercury is the conscious mind, Uranus is the individuated unconscious mind. And this Uranus in Gemini mini generation, this is a mini generation of souls who left brain, right brain, left brain, right brain, left brain, right brain. And so there you can just see how the soul is having to take its desire for spiritual growth or to know source, and again, relative to first stage spirituated here, and they have to apply it mentally, and they have to apply it through relationships. They have to apply it out there in the world. See how this Pluto polarity point rulers are pointing them towards interacting with people and interacting with the world and career, 10th house. Now, the fact that Uranus is retrograde in Gemini, it calms down the left brain and it helps point a little bit. Retrograde polarity, Sag, points to right brain. Okay, and so what it also could do is, the creativity of Pluto, of a 12th house Pluto. Again, remember the 12th house in Pisces contain all 11 archetypes that came before it. You will find a lot of people in the Hollywood industry, the actors, can have a lot of 12th house Pisces or Neptune in their chart because they're the actors. And so a 12th house Pluto can be the actor of the zodiac, so to speak. And that's why you've really got to observe, correlate 12th house Plutos to see where it's manifesting. Okay. And so as we look at all that creativity and imagination that can be here, it's Neptunian. Oh, I can just go off into my dream world and, create a whole lifetime in my sleep. But again, remember, it's got to be applied. Okay. And so it is going to be working this rulership by sign generationally. It's going to be working to ground that 12th house Pluto, grounding, this service and work. What can also happen here, I guess the point I'm getting at long-windedly is, if this is a person who could do a lot of occupations. 6th house, ruler, 10th house, they could, do this, they could do that, they could do this. And so it's there's that simplification and grounding and application of the 6th house here is with the ruler retrograde. What's best for me to do and what's not best for me to do? And with the other ruler over here, as they themselves as the volunteer himself has said, his specialty became relationships, and relationship counseling in his career. Look at how the polarity point and the rulers just show it, describe it, as it's unfolded. Now, I think the next thing is the aspects. Let me quickly bring those in for you. Same thing as we looked at before with the slide. Now, these are all the planets making aspects to the polarity point, except that this Uranus didn't show up. I didn't catch that my software math wasn't doing that. So if there were 6 planets in the nodes aspecting Pluto, there are going to be 6 planets and or 7 planets really, 7 planets in the nodes, excuse me, aspecting the Pluto polarity point as well. So all those planets that got tied to where the soul's coming from, they're also part of the picture with where the soul is intending to go. And I will, rather than, we don't have the time for all the interps, so what I want to do is kind of just point out some description for you. When you're really working on your chart interpretations, and as you saw from before, I just drew up the planets that were aspecting Pluto and just concentrated on all of them being funneled through Pluto. When you then flip and try and work with the evolutionary intent, you funnel all those planets to how they will metamorphose in going forward. And as you can see here, even the Pluto polarity point is square the nodes of the moon. That Pluto polarity point, I didn't bring this in, it's 13 degrees Aquarius. And if you reverse through the signs and houses, this is the resolution node for the Pluto polarity point. As the soul is grounding itself and moving forward and living life, it also from time to time is going to go look at its past from a deep psychological perspective here. And so that will then take this Aquarian, personality. And while it can have some detachment here, every so often there's going to be, as this volunteer described, one of those old triggers that comes up, and it just gets drawn into itself to go psychologically deep and review. Again, I'm speeding it up. Apologies just for time-wise. Leroy, would you bring our volunteer in? I'd like to give him a chance to just speak to anything he wants to in regards to his Pluto polarity point.
Yes, this is part of one of the things that I've been confused about is the polarity point. And the way you're describing it, it gives me a sense where the attention can go to sort of draw that out. A question comes up, since it's in the 6th house and the sun and moon are in the 6th house, and that would be conjunct, they would all be conjunct, I think.
Yep.
Does that, I don't want to say have an impact, or how does it work together? That's what I'm wondering.
Good point. Good question. You know how when we look at Pluto as the slowest moving planet, so we compare faster moving planets to Pluto? In evolutionary astrology, when you look at this soul's intent, the Pluto polarity point, even though this is just a point in space, we will look at this as ground zero. And we will compare the planets to the Pluto polarity point. So moon is new phase and the sun's new phase. And so as your soul is really moving forward to get in its body, okay, and to see that more objective picture about itself and follow through on those visions that come in Aquarius, those repetitious visions that come forward of this is the work that I'm here to do. It will then come through manifesting your personality and your emotional nature. And it's just like it's evolving yourself as a healer. And I use the word healer broadly. And you specifically for you, it's just been evolving you as a counselor in this lifetime.
Yes, yes, I understand that. That's very helpful. Um, uh, my life, the trajectory of my life has been moving in that direction for many, many years, but it's been a step-by-step thing. It wasn't something, I didn't start doing the therapy and counseling until I was in my 40s.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were a number of other occupations I went through before that. Um, but as it has developed, that has assisted in clarity and a sense of myself, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
One other question. I believe you said that whatever had an aspect to Pluto will have an aspect to the polarity point. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So, like Neptune and Libra will have an aspect to that point, a fairly close one. Okay, I see. I see what you're talking about. Very good.
Yes.
Yeah.
And something else that we'll just mention about a 12th house Pluto, you know, even though that evolutionary intent, 6th house, is to get in your body and be in your body, 12th house Plutos are extremely sensitive souls. They have to learn healthy boundaries. Now the Pluto and Leos are a little bit easier, better at doing that. And with that Saturn new phase Pluto, you're going to be a little better at creating healthy boundaries than the average 12th house Pluto. But I don't mean to say that you don't need your retreat time. 12th house Plutos will have to have that rest and recharge. And for you, what did it turn out to be? Your meditation.
Yeah.
So it's not that you leave the 12th house to go over to the 6th. You go towards the 6th. And that polarity point is almost like it's not just the soul's intent and lessons. It's also some objectivity that then metamorphoses the natal Pluto house, wherever that is. And so the more that you go and get into your body and work in the world, 6th house, the more that's going to lead towards metamorphosing your spiritual growth and reconnection with source. And so when to work and when to rest will be part of this picture.
Yes. I have learned that lesson over time. I didn't have that lesson learned early on.
With those planets square the nodes and Saturn new phase Pluto Leo, did you just think you could will your way forward?
Well, I sort of thought that. Yes, I did. um, and one of the things that I discovered over time is that I could easily fatigue if I pushed too hard and
Yes.
didn't get the rest.
Yes. And that's coming also off of a south node in Scorpio too. You know, south nodes in Scorpios, they will emotionally, will themselves sometimes into the picture. And yeah, so if we start to bring over that evolutionary intent with the polarity point and that north node in Taurus, it's going to be knowing what you can do and what you cannot do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so any other questions, comments, volunteer?
No, that's it. Thank you.
All right, let's quickly bring in this north node in our remaining time period here. And so, of course, what's part of the evolutionary intent or trinity moving forward is the north node. And this is the current life mode of operation, or how the ego is emotionally evolving this lifetime and is helping us to actualize the evolutionary intent of the soul, the actualizing that Pluto polarity point. And of course, included in that is the North Node rulers by sign and house. Okay, so let's just break this down quickly and look at this, okay, before we bring in the aspects. So I'm always including Pluto. Here, we've got the Pluto polarity point, and we have the North Node. The North Node is in Taurus, ninth house. The ruler of Taurus by sign is Venus again over here in Pisces 8th, and the ruler of the North Node by ninth house is Jupiter over here in Sag and 4th. And if you want to start looking at this, we have the two rulers of the North Node in a square aspect to each other. So Venus is a first quarter square to Jupiter, starting with Jupiter, going through the signs and houses. You know, Venus is 5 degrees past the 90 degrees. So Venus is 95 degrees. It's a first quarter square. And so if, you know, we start to, you know, bring this picture into it again, Pluto polarity point, evolutionary intent is to be able to objectify and ground ourselves, to put it into two words. And the ego is also saying, I've I've got to work with being able to ground myself as well. And yet these rulers over here, Jupiter is in its own sign, Sag. And while Jupiter is right brain, intuition, conscious beliefs, Jupiter is growth and expansion. And whenever you look at any planet in an aspect to Jupiter, Jupiter is always going to magnify it. It is always going to make whatever that other planet is more. Okay? And if we start to look at these two, you know, rulers right here, we start to have water houses start to come into the picture in addition to a water sign. Let's just look at this for a moment. Venus, which is, you know, self-reliance, giving and receiving love, Taurus Venus. When you put it in this first quarter square with Jupiter, you know, just looking at these two rulers, this person could kind of do an all or nothing in relationships. And they could start to do that on emotional levels. And so while the ego is striving to have some grounding to itself, if it gets emotionally triggered, ego, north node is you know, north node of the moon, ego moving forward, emotionally, you know, moving forward. If there's any emotional triggers that start to go on, they could lose some of this grounding. Okay. And they could also, and maybe not so much now, but as we've looked at the soul, you know, come through its early years in this incarnation, you know, again, what I see here, or what I sense here, and correct me if I'm wrong, volunteer, but here would be some of that early projecting onto relationships emotionally, all or nothing, you know, wanting to make the other person their emotional savior. And it took those, you know, rugs ripped out underneath, ruler Venus in eighth house, you know, to get them to, oh yeah, wait a minute. Moving forward for me is being able to really balance within myself and ground myself and not give it all away to the person I'm in relationship with. Possibly not give it all away to the client, that I'd be so burned out. Because one of the things about, again, this Aquarius polarity point is that objectivity and that ability to be, for the healer, sixth house, to be able to detach, to not do, I mean, the feminine is the Florence Nightingale, to not do all that self-sacrificing. And sometimes, the Venus signature could do this. And so the ego here would just, and especially if it's bleeding through of what we remember with the whole chart, they do all or nothing, and they'd burn themselves out so much that they'd have to, the ego would want, I just want to go be on the mountaintop all by myself. That Taurus North Node would want to isolate itself away. And so this whole picture, as it starts to come in here, there has to be those healthy boundaries between self and others so that they can balance. Venus's rulership of Libra, they can have some balance and they don't have to go to isolation. The North Node, Taurus, ninth house, there are some times where the ego needs to be able to, again, rest, recharge, but not from a self-protectionism or a reactionary, from a natural sensing that I need, the diet, exercise, and rest part. My body needs to be able to rest. My body needs to, be able to go be by myself and reflect, to then have that healthy balance in my relationships, in my work, etc. And so this would, again, be some of this interpretation of that first quarter square. First quarter square, crises in action, okay? When to do something for someone else emotionally, and when I've got to balance doing it for myself. Could we bring the volunteer in, Leroy, and hear some feedback?
Yes, your description is very, very accurate. In my first 30 years of life, um, I feel like there was a certain level of, well, basically ignorance about life, and as the rug gets pulled out, and you review what went on, and you look deeper, and so on, you begin to see, and those boundaries begin to come not as a defense mechanism, but just as a discernment of a better way to connect
Yep.
with people.
Yep.
Uh, but that was very accurate.
Yeah. That's a sixth house word as well, discernment.
Mhm.
So here's the soul, not unconditionally loving, blindly, but, the evolutionary intent, bringing in that sixth house discernment of, when it's healthy for me emotionally to give and receive in relationships, and when it's not healthy for me, and I've got to, I've got to give to myself. North Node in Taurus, I've got to sustain myself, and yes, being able to discern that as time goes by. So volunteer, can you see how this evolutionary intent in North Node came to be understood as you move through this life?
Yeah, yeah. What's fascinating about this is it came to be understood without studying anything, and then when you studies something like this and you say, yeah, that's exactly what happened. That fascinates me.
Isn't it just, doesn't it just, I mean, I've studied EA for, 33 years now, and it's just, it never ceases to fascinate me how well it explains what we call natural law. Mm-hmm. All right, let's do one more. We're going to bring in, of course, the aspects that the North Node makes. And so here we are bringing in a whole bunch of other things, and Jupiter fell away. But Jupiter has whatever that aspect is. I think it was the semi-square with the no, it'd be the Sesqui squadrate. North Node would be making a waning Sesqui squadrate to Jupiter, and it's making a waxing semi-square to Uranus. So based upon what we had said with the North Node from our previous slide, now we start to bring in all of these planets that directly aspect the North Node and help the ego move forward. So by now, as we're starting to look at this chart, you start to see these planets square the nodes, and as we spoke earlier, how much they have into this picture of, what's healthy for me and what's healthy for others. Am I, fully participating with healthy boundaries, or am I, just wanting to isolate and leave me on my mountaintop? And, the whole integration. And you can start to see here, the past life patternings that we kind of touched upon in previous slides, and how they've affected this ego being able to move itself forward in deepening self-reliance. I would say at this point in this soul's evolution, and 7 decades on planet Earth, they've really recognized and have been manifesting Taurus, 6th house Pluto polarity point, that deep self-reliance and discernment of, when to serve and when not to serve, when to give and when not to give, as you're looking at the rulers. Now, here we are with the Ho chart again. This would be the last chart slide. And so looking at time-wise, Leroy, if you would bring our volunteer back on. Any comments, questions in any regard from our volunteer? Do we have anyone listening who has questions or comments for me or our volunteer?
Okay, Kim, I do have a question on the board that's real relevant here to this Pluto polarity point. So I'm going to unmute Christina.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello, Christina.
Oh, all right. Hi, Kim Marie. Oh, that's great. Okay, my questions regards to the sun in relationship to Pluto, and the sun and then likewise sun in relationship to the Pluto polarity point. I was thinking that the sun or the Pluto polarity point is in balsamic relationship to the sun rather than new phase, because of the movement against the sun. Yeah, go ahead.
Gotcha,
Sure.
Christina.
Okay.
What I had said in EA, even though Pluto polarity point is a point in space,
Yes.
mathematically, we will make that 0, and we will compare the planets to the Pluto polarity point.
Okay,
So if we,
including the sun.
yeah.
Okay. Because isn't
Yes.
it reverse with the sun in relationship to the like Pluto?
I will compare every planet to the Pluto polarity point. This
Okay.
is where I have evolved from some of Jeffrey's original teachings.
Okay.
Jeffrey compared everything to the sun, and as I stated a little earlier, for me, just observe and correlate. We live on planet Earth, and so I compare sun to Pluto. I compare sun to Jupiter. From Jupiter, Saturn, Chiron, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, I compare the sun to the outer planets. I compare Moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars to the sun.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
So that's in general. And then specific to that Pluto polarity point, you start with the polarity point.
Yeah.
And you go counterclockwise and compare every planet and the nodes to the polarity point.
Okay.
So for me, the sun is new phase,
Okay.
that Pluto polarity point.
Great. Okay. Got it. Thanks. Appreciate it.
No worries. And something that I will do for those of you showing up on this live call, I am going to send out that handout on the cycle of phases and aspects, and I'm going to send out the handout on determining aspects where I have, shifted that interp. I'm not the only evolutionary astrologer who's done that. And the person I actually got this from was Laura Nalbandian. And if you guys don't know this history of Laura, she's the one who runs the NORWAC conference every year. And her mom and dad had the astrology bookstore in Seattle that Jeffrey walked into off the streets one day when he, first started studying astrology. And that's where he taught astrology. And so, Laura shifted in exactly what I'm describing as well. I don't know how many others do that, but it just what seemed natural for me. So you don't have to agree with me. I always raise the point that you can stick with Jeffrey's original teaching if you want to. Other comments, questions, volunteer. And Leroy from the board, if there's anybody else. And by the way, Miss Christine, Christina, it's so wonderful to have you on the classes. She just retired, so she gets to show up at our live classes.
This is Terry. At the moment, I don't have any further questions. I have a lot to absorb.
You do. You have a lot of sixth house work to study, don't you?
Yes, I do.
And hopefully we've given you some outline. Well, volunteer, I want to thank you very much for being willing to volunteer your chart. Appreciate you. And I will say for those of you who have just started with us in the last few weeks over the course of this summer, you all got a special invitation if you wanted to volunteer your chart. I'm keeping track of the names, and I'll draw a name out of the hat for next month, and I'll give you an email and let you know who that blessed person is. And again, one more time, if you are on Facebook, get a friend request off to me, Kim Marie Weimer, Rapid City, South Dakota. And then I'll get you on the Segment 1 Facebook page. It's a private group. We continue with some Q&A on there all the time, continuing to discuss this stuff further. You can always email me personally if you need to. Any other questions, comments from the board, Leroy?
Nope. Very well done, though. Thank you.
All right. Well, Soul, we wish you all the best on your spiritual reemergence back to source, 12th house Pluto, and doing it in your day-to-day world, living, loving, breathing life. All right, so here's our dates. This is all, class is always the third Tuesday, 2 to 4 p.m. Mountain Time Zone. We're going to go with 3 more months, just repeating exactly what we've done with different example. And then we'll start over in January with a new class series. So beginners, go back to those early webinars, do some catch up, go to those DVDs and streaming videos that we did, and catch those up. Those are the 2 main streams you want to follow, the webinars and the DVDs/streaming videos. And then here are the public webinars that I have coming up. We are switching my Venus retrograde class from Monday to Wednesday, October 3rd, because of family travels. Family visits, let's say it that way. Okay. And so you can go to our website, to the forecasting page, forecasting webinars page, and that's where you can sign up to enroll in any of these public webinars. All right, one more time on behalf of Leroy and I, thank you to all of those who have enrolled to study evolutionary astrology with us. We appreciate you greatly, and it's just a pleasure for me to teach evolutionary astrology. I'm going to get teary-eyed. I'm so grateful to be able to do it. Thank you very much, everyone. I'll see you next month.